Hey, Tim here, host of the Invisible Condition podcast, a podcast where we talk about unusually normal things. Imagine living in a constant state of problem solving, or always living in crisis mode. What would that feel like? How would you be showing up in your day to day? But then imagine again that something changed and you don't live like this anymore. Being diagnosed with ADHD has changed Rosanna's outlook on work and life. From living in that state of feeling imperfect or embarrassed about her imperfections to getting curious about herself and leaning into what makes her so awesome. In our conversation, Rosanna shares authentically and vulnerably about her struggles, her diagnosis, and we spend some time dreaming of a future where there's no stigma around bringing our whole selves to the workplace. Now, wouldn't that be awesome? Where we could show up as our true authentic selves. Well, stay tuned, and I really hope you enjoy our conversation. Rosanna, thank you for joining me on today's show. I'm so honored that you're here to share your story, your experience. But before we get into that, I think it's just fun to tell our listeners how we met, and that's through the power of content. And
right?
Yeah. Well, why don't you just introduce yourself a little bit? Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to be on here and to share my story. Yeah, we did meet through the power of storytelling, I guess, because you read an article about management that I thought was the best thing that I'd read about management. And I couldn't help it. I just wrote to you and said, this is the best thing I think I've read online about management, and I read about it all the time. And then you know, when we got to chatting, and then we realized actually there was an opportunity to work together. So, so yes, we are here. We were brought together by the power of content.
Power of content. Yeah. And a little bit about you. You're a freelance writer. You write. That's your
right.
job. Do you call it a job?
That is my job. I do call it a job, very much a job. I have a small freelance writing business, is how I would probably think about it. I've been writing now professionally for about 6 years, and I have to say, I love it.
Yeah, you went from that corporate setting, that corporate world, into freelancing. And I don't want to spend all of our time here, but I'm just curious because I know, people like myself who live with something invisible condition is often feeling like, okay, is the 9 to 5 is the workplace where I need to be, or how do I jump into this world of, everyone's a freelancer, so I'll just jump in with that. And how was that transition for you?
It was both wonderful and challenging. Definitely the best of times and the worst of times. On the one hand, being an employee, and I guess we'll come to this later, but the invisible condition that I live with is ADHD. As an employee, one of the things that being an employee gives you is that structure, that regular schedule, somebody to tell you what to do. Suddenly, when you're working for yourself, the training wheels are off, and if you have ADHD, it gives you a lot of challenges around time management, productivity, task management. And so, yeah, it was a steep learning curve, I would say, at the beginning.
Yeah, and you alluded to it, diagnosed with ADHD. When you were in that work world, how did that really kind of affect you? How did it? Well, let's back up a minute. When were you diagnosed with ADHD? Would you be able to share with us?
This year.
This year. Okay.
Actually, formally diagnosed a couple of months ago.
Okay.
I knew that there was something going on, and was misdiagnosed with a whole bunch of other things, but didn't actually get an ADHD diagnosis until this year, which is unfortunately still very common, especially for women.
Wow. Okay. Well, I want to touch on that a little bit, and so big diagnosis this year. It's the year 2023. You know that you've lived with something for forever. And when you were in that corporate setting, there's lots of pressure, you're in a high functioning role. How was work? How were you able to perform and with work and life? And I know you're a mom, and if you share some insight there.
Yeah. I was very tired a lot, I would say, is the short answer. How was I able to perform at work? ADHD is one of those conditions where you are consistently inconsistent. So I can be very, very strong at certain aspects of work and really struggle with other aspects which might seem to somebody else much more basic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I would be able to deliver a very high quality piece of work, but on the other hand, struggle to deliver it on time, or I would struggle to, remember the basics, tick the boxes, that kind of stuff. Anything administrative and tedious is a real struggle for people with ADHD. And because I wasn't diagnosed, I just thought it was me. I just thought I was flaky and incompetent and, should probably not aim too high. Wow. Professionally.
Okay. So it's just knowing that now that you look back and see the symptoms and how it affected your life, and now what made now the right time to pursue a diagnosis?
I think because, well, why now? A lot of things came together at the same time. I was talking to a friend who'd recently been diagnosed, and the symptoms he was describing, I was like, oh, that's me. I was, managing my own business and having some great results, but noticing that there were some areas that I was still really struggling with. And I suppose just being that little bit older and having got to a point in my life where I'm like, perhaps there's something else going on. Perhaps this is not just my failure and my problem. Maybe I should look and see if there is a solution here. And so it is something that's come up on my radar a few times over the years. But ADHD being what it is, I would, remember about it and then forget about it. Or not, follow through to the end of actually seeking a diagnosis. And so I guess it's just a lot of things came together at the same time, and it seemed like the right time.
Yeah. And so, like you said, you saw a pattern, you saw something throughout the history of work and life, and talking with a friend, it just kind of sparked something of, okay, maybe I need to see something. But you mentioned something that I never really made a connection to previously, which is you're pretty hard on yourself, and I'm curious how that may have had an impact on you and throughout your journey, I'm I self-admit I don't know a lot about ADHD, so I'm just curious how now being diagnosed, looking back, and how this has really kind of changed your trajectory, changed your outlook.
Oh, it's been incredible. It's absolutely changed how I see myself.
Wow.
I would say. You're right. I am hard on myself, and that's a work in progress. But having an explanation for why I am the way I am, and then finding an entire community of other people who are exactly the same way, which has also been a total game changer. Yeah, it's been a complete revelation, and it's made me feel able to, I guess, forgive myself for shortcomings now that I know that they're actually symptoms. And instead of approaching things from the point of view of, oh, that's just me, oh, I'm just flaky, or I'm just dumb, or whatever, I now come at it with the, okay, so that's a challenge, how can we solve it? which is obviously a much healthier and also more constructive way of dealing with it.
I love that reframe. And it's not easy to make that reframe of going, okay, this is something I live with. Let's figure it out and embrace it. And as you said, find a community of people, and it's opened up a community. And I know that there's so much stigma about sharing. And so tell me about tapping into this new community that you've uncovered or discovered.
Well, I love listening to podcasts, and I have found that there are so many incredibly useful podcasts about ADHD. And just listening to people sharing their stories, listening to people talking about what it's like, and just, it feels like finding my tribe. And I'm incredibly lucky. I have wonderful close friends. However, it's a different feeling when you hear people whose brains work the way your brain works, whose struggles are the same as yours, who've experienced what life is like with ADHD, and who do the same ridiculous things that people with ADHD do. We do strange and wonderful things. And it's lovely to find other people sharing their stories, and they're, we can be very competent and very professionally, impressive or whatever, and then struggle with the most basic things in life. And it's just very refreshing to hear other people talking about that. I think that's been very, very helpful for me.
Yeah. I'm going to put you on the spot, and I think I told you I wasn't going to, but I'm curious if you have an example of something, like you just said, like where, some things do it with ease and some things are not. I'm just curious how it shows up in you and with you and in your life and with your family.
That's a great question. Well, if I think about work, for example, sometimes people talk about ADHD as being a superpower. And while I don't love that description, it can be incredibly helpful in work. So, for example, if I'm really focused on a project, ADHD is very poorly named. We don't have a deficit of attention. We have a deficit of control of where that attention goes. But if it happens to go onto the work that I'm supposed to be doing, I can be prolific. I can be incredibly productive, probably more so than somebody who doesn't have ADHD. We also tend to be very, very good in a crisis, for example, because we live in crisis. Everything is a crisis. With ADHD, you've always forgotten something or, dropped the ball somewhere. So you're constantly problem solving under pressure, which means that when a real, work crisis comes up, you need the person with ADHD in the room. They will be the person who you could go to who will be like, oh, this is fine. We've sorted it. On the other hand, so that's where I guess it shows up as a strength. In terms of the basics, the weaknesses, I have a lot of problems with being on time to meet people, for example. I have one particular friend who is incredibly punctual, and punctuality is very important to her. And I know this, and I love her, and I want to be on time for her. And every single time I meet her, something goes wrong. And I'm always reliably 15 minutes late. And because I'm very lucky, and she is a very kind person, she lets it go. But that kind of thing, things that you feel like as an adult, as a 40-year-old woman, I should know how to leave the house on time. That's an example.
Thank you so much for sharing that, your examples. I think, for people who are listening, sharing examples makes it real, and potentially drives that connection, and drives that deeper insight. So I appreciate you sharing, and for allowing me to put you on the spot. And I as you know, I'm really passionate about story and about sharing and that vulnerability. And I keep reading article after article about the workplace. I'm fascinated about the world of leadership and management, and I keep reading about, in order to create high performing workplaces, we need to create that foundation of trust, and leaders need to be vulnerable. And yet we still have, we're still living in this work world where people are just miserable. And
Right.
We're afraid to be vulnerable. What does vulnerability mean to you?
I think what I'm doing right now feels very vulnerable. And the reason is because I am being very honest about my lived experience, and about areas of who I am that are less than perfect. I think as a professional in the workplace, whether that's as a freelancer or when I've been an employee, I think there's a tremendous amount of pressure placed on people to sort of perform themselves, to perform their own identity, to show up and be like, no, I am perfect, I'm fine, I've got everything together. It's both very vulnerable and I think very powerful to show up and say, I'm not perfect, I don't have it all together. Sometimes I make terrible mistakes, sometimes I make embarrassing mistakes. And I think that can be very helpful because, people listening to that, and I think especially if you're a manager, people listening to that will hear that and say, oh, okay, that gives me permission to be vulnerable too, to be imperfect. And from my own, current work situation, my work got dramatically better. My writing got dramatically better when I started showing up as myself and writing the way that I wanted to and the way that I speak, and being funny, or I think it's funny, or being slightly cheeky, or swearing when it's appropriate, or using weird and wonderful examples that my ADHD brain throws up constantly. That's a way that I've introduced vulnerability into my own work, and I think it's reflected in the fact that my work got better.
You said something that just strikes so much emotion in me, and that is your ability to show up as yourself. And so often in life, regardless if it's work or home or friends, sometimes when we have something that is invisible, it's hard to show up as ourselves. And whether at least for me, I can speak on for me, and I don't want to speak for anybody else, but it's that stigma that I've made up, and sometimes I've made up in my own mind because of past experience. And yet we know that in order to reduce and remove the stigma one of the ways is to advocate. In order to be advocate is to share and to be vulnerable. And yet then we get into this weird cycle of, but I don't want to share because of the stigma, but I want to be an and so how, our purpose is really to remove the stigma that surrounds visible conditions. When you hear that, what comes to mind? What needs to change? What is your hope for that future, for that for the world where people might be afraid to share?
I hope that managers can start to receive some training around having difficult conversations with people in their teams. So many managers, and this is something you and I have talked about before, are thrown into management because they're very good at their job. And that really has very little to do with whether or not they're a good manager. And suddenly they're in a position of authority over people where they're expected to encourage and foster connection and relationship, and they're suddenly in a position where they're having very difficult conversations with people with absolutely no training whatsoever on how to do that, or how to create psychological safety, for want of to use a trendy phrase, or how to be empathetic, really. It's not something that comes naturally to everyone. And it's not something that we tend to promote people for. Whereas in fact, that's exactly who you should promote, is the most empathetic person in the room, because they're going to be the person who's going to be able to bring the best out of the rest of the team, who's going to be able to have these very vulnerable conversations, who's going to create an atmosphere where people do feel like they can be themselves and be vulnerable and be flawed. I don't know if that answers your question.
It
but
does.
I think that's one of the things I'm hoping for.
Yeah, the empathy, creating that place of psychological safety, training, managers, especially new managers, and existing, maybe you've been a manager for 20, 30 years. Creating that space where people can be vulnerable. And, again, speaking on for myself is, well, if I'm vulnerable and I share, then maybe I'm not able to perform my current job. So then maybe there's fear that I might now get passed up for a promotion, or I might get let go, and there's just all that fear of emotion. But any thoughts or insights or wisdom you'd like to share to someone who might be even listening and going, yes, I want to share, but I don't think I can?
I would say, I certainly think this does come up a lot for people with ADHD. There's a lot of stigma around ADHD, and if you are worried about sharing it with someone, you have a reason to be sometimes, because ADHD is one of those conditions that people think they know all about it. They have a lot of preconceived ideas, and I say this as somebody who had those preconceived ideas. One of the reasons that never occurred to me that I had ADHD is because of my preconceived ideas about what it looked like, and what it would mean. And so if you are fearful about, say, talking, asking for workplace accommodations, talking to your manager, it may be that you need to provide your own accommodations. For example, you might not feel comfortable saying to your manager, I have ADHD, but you might feel comfortable saying to your manager, if we're working on a big project, please can you provide me with multiple check-ins and deadlines, because that will help me to make sure that I can, keep on the same page with you. And, you can also be thinking, and also it will help me make sure that I don't procrastinate this to the last minute, which is something that ADHD people have a tendency to do. So I think I would say look for opportunities to create your own workplace accommodations, and look for opportunities to create your own sense of psychological safety. An awful lot of time, and I think this is something you've touched on just now, is we are our own worst enemies and worst critics, and sometimes a lot of the stigma that we think other people might have about our invisible condition is all in our heads. And so I think there are opportunities in the workplace to stop beating yourself up for being imperfect or for having a condition, and stop judging yourself first.
So powerful, Rosanna. It's just that stop beating yourself up. Stop judging yourself. We are perfectly imperfect.
Yes.
That's a phrase that I've grown accustomed to live by, that my definition of perfect and normal is different than your definition, and is different than my partners and my friends and workplaces. Is the sense of normal. Part of me just wants to get rid of that word out of our vocabulary, because I don't know what normal is. I just have no idea. I've gone to AI tools to try and understand, what do they believe normal is, and it's to me it's superficial. And so we have been given, or we live with these conditions, often invisible. That's the focus of our show, is invisible conditions. And so there's almost that an extra level of some stigma there, where, okay, I've heard stories of, well, prove that you're disabled, prove that you have something. And so when somebody's listening, I just love that encouragement, Rosanna, which is, how do, our own judgment, we're imperfect, and let's embrace that. And do you have, I'm curious about, you had preconceived notions of ADHD and now diagnosed with ADHD and finding this voice and finding this community. Is there anything in your routine or your life that has helped you kind of reframe things, reframe that notion or that judgment?
Yes, I think that I saw a great analogy the other day that someone was saying, one of the things with ADHD is that a lot of the challenges that you're working with, everyone has to a certain extent. Everyone procrastinates sometimes. Nobody likes to work on boring tasks. Most people will struggle with time management or task management in some situations. It's a little bit like being short-sighted, which I also am. If you sit someone far enough away from the screen, they're not going to be able to see it. And that's going to be true for everybody. With ADHD, in order to see it while we're sitting in the same place, we're going to need glasses. And in terms of how that's shown up for me, it's creating the structures and framework that mean that I can do my job. It may mean acknowledging areas of weakness and compensating for them, and technology is wonderful for that. And one example is I have a lot of notifications going off all the time, which I know you can probably hear over the mic, so I'm sorry. That's a way that I've harnessed the tools in my life anyway to give me reminders and prompts and make sure that I don't drop the ball. Something that I found incredibly helpful is something called body doubling, which is where I can work online with somebody else who probably also has some trouble with focus. And there's an app that I use called FocusMate, which is great if you are having a low energy day. I think it would be helpful for all kinds of invisible conditions, not just for ADHD, because it gives you that structure that you might need to push through when you are, for example, feeling tired or having a low energy day, or just not feeling great. And you literally work, you turn up, you say what you're going to work on for the next 25 minutes or 50 minutes, you work together, and then at the end you report back. And it sounds very weird, but it's absolutely transformational. It's crazily effective. It's been the single best thing I've done for my business. And this platform, for example, costs about, I think, $10 a month. And yeah, it's a hugely helpful thing especially if you're working from home and you don't have anyone you can partner with. Other frameworks and structures that I find helpful, if you have ADHD, I think using a calendar, using a single to-do list, and having an everything book. These are the things that I would say that everyone with ADHD could benefit from. And the everything book being, every single note, it's not in a different notebook every day. It's all in the same book. So you can find it, and just sort of externalizing the parts of your brain that need a little bit of extra support. Sorry.
Well, I think that's great. And at the beginning of the show, I even said, hey, if you have your notifications on, turn them off. And I love how you normalize that. And even for me, it's helping me to understand how you live with ADHD and normalize that this is what you need. So I know there's podcast hosts and producers who are like, no, we got to turn everything off, but this is what you need. So let's embrace that and normalize it. So thank you for educating me and teaching me that it's okay to hear the ringing and the dings, and because it's your story, not mine, and you've invited me into your story. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And the body doubling just sounds scary, but I could.
A lot of people say that it's weirdly effective, but I think until you've done it once, you're like, I'm going to sit and have a meeting with a stranger where we work in silence. It sounds very awkward. It's so good.
Yeah. I just think about, I could sit here at my computer for 2 hours and my partner Tanya will say, well, what did you work on? And I have no idea. And so it's like, what an amazing, almost accountability tool of sitting down. So there's some great tips and practical tips that has helped you. And I know when we were talking about Invisible Condition, this project that I'm working on, and it's scary for me. It's scary for a lot of people who are going to share. And what makes now the right time to share your story? And how have you embraced that scariness of throwing it out there?
I love that. I love that question. I believe that if you have been given privilege, then you have the obligation or the duty to use that privilege to help other people. And I have a lot of privilege. I'm very lucky that I've stumbled into a career and a way of life that are ideally suited for my condition. I do work that I find fascinating. I can make my own schedule. I have enough time in my day to exercise, to do self-care, to meditate, all the things that make my brain work well. And I'm also, now, surrounded by wonderful friends, a very supportive spouse, incredible family. And I work for myself, so I don't have the fear of an employer listening to this and going, oh, I'm not sure about this one. So I don't have any excuse really not to use all of that luck to try and help people who don't have those kind of privileges. Mm-hmm. I recognize that I'm extremely lucky, and I would like to, if I can, help people who are not in the same situation. I think that's just part of being a human being, right? If you are lucky, you reach out and help people who need help.
And I think just you sharing and being vulnerable will help. I know it's helped me and it's encouraged me. And so I thank you for sharing. And I know, people who are listening, and maybe somebody's listening as a leader or an individual contributor, whoever you are in an organization. It's like, heck yes. It's time to get rid of that word normal, because we're all different. And it's time to invite people to share their story in a safe space, in a judgment-free place, and a place where we can truly want to accommodate and drive that change just in our workplaces, in our society, that is needed. And it starts by sharing that story. And so thank you for sharing that. And I think of hope for the future. And one thing that I really want from this show is for people to share what their hope and encouragement is for the future. Hope and encouragement they want to leave for our listeners. Is there anything that comes to mind? Anything you want to leave us with?
I am very hopeful that we are, as a society, making a much better and more inclusive workplace. I think we are on the right track. I think it's slow. I think it's frustratingly slow. And I think that it very much depends who you are and what your struggles are, what your challenges are, to how much you will feel that this is true. But I do think that, I think the pandemic was horrendous for so many people, but I do think that some good came out of it in terms of forcing us to realize in a work context that we're all people and that we have challenges and we aren't perfect. And, you know, some of us were working while parenting and some of us were working in incredibly difficult situations. And I think if we can take a lesson from that, it was that we need to create a safer place for people to work. And just we need to be aware that we all have needs as human beings and that those needs need to be recognized if we are to thrive and do our best work. And from the most bottom line point of view, if you create kind of workplaces where people can show up as themselves, where people can be vulnerable, you create a more innovative company, you create a more productive company, you create a happier work environment, you create better collaboration. You know, there's a lot of very hard-nosed reasons to think about accommodating invisible conditions and creating a better environment for people with these conditions. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what I would like to leave everyone with, is the hope that we are on the right track. And then on an individual, from a personal point of view, it is eminently possible to create the kind of life that you are imagining and that you are hoping for, regardless of your condition. It may not look the way that you expect, and it may not be perfect, but you can be happy and fulfilled. You can find ways to use your condition to find a positive side to your condition. That is possible. You don't have to be a victim of your own circumstances. And that there are people out here who are here to help and would like to help.
It's powerful. I can see the future, and future that my kids and your son will grow up in, where there's no fear of sharing. It's no fear of saying to your organization, whether you're working in-house or not, but you're sharing that, hey, I live with this, and this is how it shows up for me. It's like, okay, thanks for sharing. Anything you need from us? Yes, I need to-do lists, and I need deadlines, and you need to remind me. It's like, okay, cool. I'll do that, and let's find some technology that also helps, and to create a place that you can thrive. And yeah, that's a future I want to be part of, where we're not afraid. And I've had so many messages come through LinkedIn since I've very vulnerably shared that I wanted to create some noise in this space of people who are just deathly afraid. Hey, I'm applying for a new job. I want to share, but not right now because I might not get the job. Hey, I want to share, but my boss will likely listen to this and I'm fearful for my job. I want to share because our company is doing something, going on a trip, and they didn't think of my condition. And so now I can't go, and I feel excluded. And so there's so much fear still wrapped in this. And I get it. I'm one of those people. But the hope for the future, Rosanna, is, as you say, is bright. I think, and I love that encouragement. Reach out. There's people that want to help. People in your own community, your ADHD community. I live with Crohn's and arthritis, and so living in that community, but also cross communities. I think there's opportunity to share, and your experience may help somebody like me understand, and it has helped me because I don't have a lot of insight into ADHD, and so I've got some basic understanding, but even just learning from you over this last 30, 40 minutes has really helped me. And so thank you for that. And I think if you're a leader and somebody shares with you, get curious. Well, first you got to care. Just care. Don't get curious if you don't care. I wrote an article about authentic curiosity and self-serving curiosity. So if you don't care, own it. Don't pretend. You'll probably lose your team, but that's fine. Just, if that's who you are, just own it. And but if you're authentically curious, just get curious and ask some questions. How can I help? What support do you need? Is there anything I've done that has not served you well? And take that feedback and do something with it. So I'm rambling. I could go on. Rosanna, you've sparked so much insight in my brain right now. And I'm like, I got to start. I just want to take a pause and just write a couple pages of notes. But as we
me too.
As we wrap up, one thing before we wrap up, I know you're a freelancer, and based on our conversations, you've pitched to a client, we won't say names, about writing about invisible conditions. And how did that go?
They loved it. They jumped on the opportunity. I read an article the other day that made me realize how incredibly oblivious I am myself, which was a wake-up call, because I like to think of myself as somewhat empathetic. But anyway, so I had been writing a series of articles about, I'll be specific, about paid time off, and had never really thought about the fact that paid time off is a huge issue for people with conditions, visible or otherwise. And for example, companies with unlimited time off, there's lots of arguments on either side, but for people with any kind of invisible condition or disability, that's an incredible benefit, because they're not having to use their vacation time on sick days, or days days that they need to take off because they're exhausted, or they're managing their invisible condition in one way or another. And there was a complete blind spot for me. So anyway, I wrote to a client who I knew, I think of as being a real sort of thought leader in this space, and said, hey, this is a blind spot for me. It might be a blind spot for you. Shall we do something about it? And shall we write some articles about how to help managers support employees with invisible conditions? Anyway, they came back with an immediate and incredibly enthusiastic response, because they said it was a very timely reminder. And one of the statistics that I shared with them is that the estimate is that 25% of the US workforce is living with some kind of condition that would usually require workplace accommodations, and yet the number of people who feel comfortable disclosing is something like 5%. Clearly this is a huge problem, and companies have, what is that, a quarter of their workforce struggling silently, or a fifth of their workforce struggling silently. They need to do something. This is an idea that time has come, and we should be talking about it and shouting about it.
Yeah, talking about it, shouting about it. I love that our conversations have, and our friendship has grown over this last year, and that you're passionate to share, and you're not just sharing, but you're driving that ripple of change, reaching out to clients saying, hey, we need to talk about this, and here's why, and clients saying, you're right, let's do it. That's such an encouragement to me, and for people who are listening, I hope that's an encouragement for you as well. Maybe you have connections to write in publications. Invisiblecondition.com is a place where I invite people to write as well. And maybe it's just sitting down with your family members or your friends or your coworkers or your manager and be that ripple of change. Sit down with your HR department and say, hey, I'd love to lead a session on whatever your condition is, and see what happens. Be that ripple of change. Otherwise, we're not going to see change. So, Rosanna, thank you so much for inviting us into your story, and for overcoming that anxiousness and that fear and leaning in with such vulnerability. You're an inspiration to me, and I know for so many who are listening. So if people are encouraged and want to connect, what's the best way to reach you?
The best place is probably LinkedIn. I'm on there, Rosanna Campbell. And I'd love to hear from people who listen to this podcast. If you have questions, if there's something I can help with, give me a shout. I would love to help. And Tim, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share. It feels great to be talking about this openly, and I hope that in the same way that other people's stories have helped me and inspired me, I hope that I can help somebody who needs to hear this, just to know that change is possible, that you are good enough, and that, you know, you don't have to be a victim of your circumstances and your condition. You are an agent of your own future.
Such good encouragement to end on. Rosanna, thank you again for coming on, and I'll definitely have a link in the show notes to Rosanna's LinkedIn, as well as links to the website and how you can get in touch with me through LinkedIn, as well as through invisiblecondition.com. Our goal is to remove, not reduce, but to remove the stigma that surrounds invisible conditions. We won't stop until that stigma is gone. And so if you want to be part of this change, reach out. There's multiple ways that you can get involved with the podcast, with writing content, being interviewed. This is just starting, and it's already causing and creating change. So Rosanna, thanks for being part of this. And for those who are listening, tell your friends, your family, and be encouraged today. So with that, go and have a fantastic day.